This video is brought to you by pinesandmaples.ca, where you can find all sorts of great Canadian products made by Canadian creators. Enjoy!
Abbé Claude Bernoux suggested that LaSalle abandon his original plan and marry his ambition with a more promising enterprise, which he had already set into motion. Earlier that year, Louis XIV had invaded the western frontier of the Holy Roman Empire, where he hoped to construct a series of fortresses for the purpose of strengthening France's eastern border. The Holy Roman Empire and its close ally, Spain, retaliated by engaging France in what is known today as the War of the Reunions. Since France was now at war with Spain, Bernoux had suggested to a courtier named Jean-Baptiste Colbert Marquis de Sangles that the French army establish a base at the mouth of a New World river known today as the Rio Grande, from which it could launch an invasion into New Spain and capture its rich silver mines. When LaSalle arrived in France, Bernoux suggested that the explorer increase the odds of his own success while simultaneously adding weight to the abbot's proposal by suggesting to the court that the aforementioned military base be built near the mouth of the Mississippi instead of that of the Rio Grande, and recommending himself as the leader of the invasion of new Spanish territory. In order to convince the court that the Mississippi would make a suitable staging point for the invasion of New Spain, LaSalle would have to allow Bernoux to doctor his account of his voyage so that the geography of the lower Mississippi seemed more accordant with that of the Rio Grande. He would also need to create a map of the Mississippi which showed a tributary of that river, known today as the Red River, lying closer to Spanish territory than LaSalle had reason to believe it did. Despite its inherent dangers, LaSalle agreed to the abbot's proposal, drawing an erroneous map of the Mississippi and allowing Bernoux to edit his account of his voyage. Armed with these fraudulent documents, LaSalle presented his case to the Marquis de Sangles. LaSalle convinced the courtier of the merit of his proposal and through him received royal permission to oversee the new province of Louisiana. More than that, King Louis XIV restored LaSalle's appropriated assets and gave the explorer 100 soldiers, 8 officers, a 36-cannon warship, a cargo vessel, and 2 smaller ships, along with orders to seize Spanish possessions up the Rio Grande. In accordance with LaSalle's orders, Henri de Tonty had received Labarre's agent, Louis-Henri de Bowie, with courtesy. Despite his pleasant reception, Bowie spent the winter of 1683-1684 attempting to convince Tonty's men to abandon the fort and work for Labarre. His efforts were for naught. The explorers remained faithful to their employer. On March 12, 1684, the Frenchmen were besieged by 200 Iroquois warriors who took up residence outside the fort's palisaded walls. After spending 6 days holed up in the fort, the defenders were relieved by a party of Illinois braves who drove the Iroquois away. Back in France, LaSalle prepared to embark on what would be his final transatlantic voyage. On July 24, 1684, the explorer and his men, accompanied by several Recollect missionaries, including LaSalle's own brother and nephew, and a number of unmarried girls who were to populate the Louisiana colony, set sail for the New World. Rather than ingratiate himself with his new men, LaSalle incurred the resentment of many of his subordinates on the voyage across the Atlantic. Due to a dearth of space, LaSalle's men were forced to sleep exposed to the elements on the decks of the ships. Ignoring the advice of his second-in-command, a French Royal Navy captain named Tanguy Gallois de Beaujeu, LaSalle refused to stop for water at the island of Madeira. When his sailors, following the Gulf Stream, reached the Tropic of Cancer, they prepared to baptize newcomers to the tropics in the maritime fashion of the day, namely, by lowering them over the side of the boat in a pulley-drawn bucket and dunking them thrice into the sea. Initiates could escape this rite of passage by paying the crew in coin or liquor. LaSalle refused to allow his sailors to extort his crew in this way, much to their irritation. By the time they reached the Caribbean, LaSalle and much of his crew had come down with some sort of illness. Most of the crew stopped at the town of Port-au-Paix, located on Saint-Domingue, the French portion of Hispaniola, across La Torta Channel from Tortuga Island. In defiance of LaSalle's orders, Captain Beaujeu, who had grown to despise LaSalle, decided to anchor in the harbor of Petit Goave, a town located on the southerly Tiburon Peninsula. On the way, Beaujeu lost one of his smaller boats, filled with munitions and provisions, to Spanish privateers. The would-be colonists spent the next few months resting in port. Some recovered from their illnesses, while others succumbed to theirs. The Frenchmen, LaSalle among them, finally resumed their journey in November, sailing past the island of Cuba and into the Gulf of Mexico. The explorers unwittingly sailed west, past the mouth of the Mississippi River. LaSalle, who was in command of the fastest ship in his tiny fleet, sailed his vessel along the coast in search of the river. He reunited with the rest of his crew off the coast of Matagorda Island, located about 400 miles west of the Mississippi and 150 miles north of the mouth of the Rio Grande. Beaujeu accused the explorer of deserting him, while LaSalle accused the captain of neglecting to follow him. While LaSalle and Beaujeu proceeded to argue over whether or not to return to France empty-handed, some of their crew members, who had been sent to explore the nearby shore on foot, were captured by a band of Indians. LaSalle set out to rescue the men, prompting the crew of one of his 3 remaining ships to sail after him into Matagorda Bay and fatally crash into a reef. After overtaking the Indians and convincing them to release his men, LaSalle ordered his crew to unload the cargo from the foundering ship. Many supplies were lost during this operation. To make matters worse, the Frenchmen were subsequently attacked by the Indians whom they had recently encountered. 2 men were killed in the ambush, while another 2 were wounded. This was too much for Beaujeu. After taking on several Frenchmen who decided to desert LaSalle, the Navy captain set sail for France, leaving the explorer and his much reduced crew to fend for themselves. LaSalle and his remaining men and women constructed a hasty fort from the remains of their sunken ship. That accomplished, they spent their days hunting, fishing, and exploring the surrounding area, always on the lookout for roving Indians and Spanish sails. Over the next few months, 2 men deserted, another was hanged for attempting to desert, and an officer was fatally bitten by a snake. LaSalle became convinced, during the course of his local explorations, that the Mississippi must lie somewhere to the east. Before setting out in search of that easterly waterway, he had his men construct a more permanent fort on the shores of the Lavaca River, which empties into Matagorda Bay. The explorers spent the summer of 1685 executing this task under the harsh direction of LaSalle, having to haul timber from a forest about 3.5 miles away under the sweltering Texan sun. 30 men died during this process from illness and heat stroke. On November 1st, LaSalle and a company of explorers headed east, leaving a sizable crew behind to man the fort. They were accompanied by the crew of their last remaining vessel, the Belle, which followed them along the coast. During the course of their journey, the explorers encountered a number of native bands, some of whom they were compelled to scare away with their firearms. Members of one of the bands with which they met told them about the Spaniards who patrolled the coast and claimed that they were universally hated by all the tribes in the area. The company finally reached the shores of some river, which some of the crew members thought might be the Mississippi. There, they built a fort of wooden palisades. When the fort was complete, LaSalle and his men retraced their steps to the fort on the Lavaca River. During the return journey, 6 of LaSalle's men were killed in a skirmish with the natives. Shortly thereafter, the Belle and her crew mysteriously disappeared. On April 22, 1686, LaSalle set out for the distant realm of New France, where he hoped to secure provisions and equipment for his colonists. Accompanied by a party of 20, which included his brother and nephew, he hiked to the fort that his men had recently constructed on the shores of that mysterious river to the west. There, he found the 5 surviving crew members of the Belle, who told him that the ship had wrecked on a sandbar. The explorers proceeded northeast over the prairies, fording 5 rivers and encountering several bands of natives, one of which attempted to ambush them in the night, and another of which sold them 5 horses. On the way, LaSalle lost 12 of his men, most of them to desertion, and one of them to an alligator. Shortly after reaching what is known today as the Natchez River, the weary explorers decided to return to the fort on the Lavaca, having failed their Herculean mission. The colonists spent a cheerless winter at the fort. On the Feast of Epiphany, 1687, LaSalle and a company of explorers set out on yet another impossibly long expedition to Canada. The Frenchmen followed their previous trail northeast, crossing prairies and rivers and supplementing their meager diet with fresh buffalo they killed along the way. When they reached the end of their previous trail, LaSalle ordered a company of his men to search for a cache of dried vegetables they had buried the previous year. Although the contents of the cache proved to have spoiled, the foragers managed to kill several buffalo on their way back to the main camp and proceeded to process the meat. Several of the hunters decided to keep some choice cuts of meat and fat for themselves, as was their right. However, when LaSalle's nephew, Moranget, who had left the main party to search for them, found the hunters and learned of their appropriations, he flew into a rage and confiscated all the meat. To the weary explorers who had endured months of privation, malnutrition, and hard labor with little reward for their efforts, Moranget's actions were unforgivable. One of the hunters, named Pierre Duyou, convinced 4 of his companions to help him murder Moranget. In order to get away with their crime, they would also need to kill 2 of their companions who were loyal to LaSalle, and so they agreed to murder those men as well. That night, when the 3 victims had completed their watch and were fast asleep, Duyou and his conspirators rose from their blankets and dispatched the hapless trio with an axe. When the grisly work was done, the murderers decided they ought to assassinate LaSalle himself, as much in order to prevent their future recrimination as to gratify the hatred they had developed towards the leader of their sorry expedition. When his nephew, Moranget, failed to return to the main camp after 2 days, LaSalle went to look for him. He was accompanied by a Recollect friar named Anastase Douay and 2 Indians. According to the friar, in a later reminiscence, LaSalle, throughout the course of their excursion, spoke to me of nothing but matters of piety, grace, and predestination, enlarging on the debt he owed to God, who had saved him from so many perils during more than 20 years of travel in America. Suddenly I saw him overwhelmed with a profound sadness, for which he himself could not account. He was so much moved that I scarcely knew him. The small party soon came to a small river, above which LaSalle spied 2 large birds flying in a circle, as if attracted by the scent of blood and decay. The explorer then fired 2 pistols in the air in order to attract his missing men. The shots were heard by Duyou and company, who were on the other side of the river. The conspirators stealthily crossed the stream and made their way through the long grass towards the hapless explorer, muskets in hand. One of the conspirators, a 15-year-old servant of Duyou named L'Archevêque, emerged from concealment and presented himself to LaSalle. The explorer asked the young man where Moranget was, and L'Archevêque replied in an insolent tone that he was somewhere downriver. Furious at the teenager's lack of respect, LaSalle made his way towards L'Archevêque. Suddenly, 2 shots rang out from the tall grass, and 43-year-old Rene-Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, fell dead with a musket ball in his head. The murderers then called out to the terrified friar Duyou that he had nothing to fear and approached the body of their former captain. After mocking LaSalle's corpse, they stripped it naked and dragged it into the brush. The words of one of LaSalle's loyal followers, Henri Joutel, who wrote about his experience in Texas in a later reminiscence, constitute an appropriate epitaph for the fallen explorer. His firmness, his courage, his great knowledge of the arts and sciences, which made him equal to every undertaking, and his untiring energy, which enabled him to surmount every obstacle, would have won at least a glorious success for his grand enterprise, had not all of his fine qualities been counterbalanced by a haughtiness of manner, which often made him insupportable, and by a harshness towards those under his command, which drew upon him an implacable hatred, and was at last the cause of his death. After disposing of LaSalle's body, Duyou and the rest of the conspirators, accompanied by Douay, rejoined the main party and informed them of their deed. Duyou claimed authority over the tiny company and decided not to kill LaSalle's brother and others who had been loyal to the explorer. The Frenchmen then paid a visit to a nearby Indian village in order to purchase supplies. There the conspirators quarreled amongst themselves over whether to return to the fort on the Lavaca or head up the Mississippi to Canada. The argument evolved into a brutal shootout, which left Pierre Duyou and another of the conspirators dead. Following their falling out, one of the remaining Frenchmen stayed with the Indians, while the remainder made the long journey up the Mississippi and Illinois to Fort St. Louis, losing one of their number along the way to drowning. There, they reunited with Henri de Tonty and his men, who had been fighting the Iroquois, with whom New France was again at war. Strangely, the explorers neglected to inform Tonty and his men of LaSalle's fate. They continued up the Illinois to the Great Lakes and New France beyond, keeping LaSalle's assassination a secret until they reached the court of King Louis XIV in France. Henri de Tonty finally learned of LaSalle's death in September 1687. Indignant, the Italian explorer decided that it was his duty to bring his commander's murderers to justice, rescue the colonists on the Lavaca River, and perhaps carry out LaSalle's planned invasion of Spanish possessions on the Rio Grande. He left Fort St. Louis with 5 Frenchmen and a handful of Indians, but was forced to abandon the mission due to a string of mishaps which occurred along the way. Back on the Lavaca River, the sorry remnants of LaSalle's colony were decimated by an outbreak of smallpox. Most of the survivors were subsequently killed by Indian warriors, and the remainder were captured by Spaniards shortly thereafter. Thus perished the final enterprise of Rene-Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, the great French explorer who founded French Louisiana.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please check out our website pinesandmaples.ca, where you can find all sorts of great Canadian products.